Welcome to the Covert Narcissism podcast. I'm your host, Renee Swanson. I am not a therapist, and you are not a victim. Welcome back to the Covert Narcissism podcast, where we look beneath the surface of polished stories to uncover the quiet pain and the powerful resilience that live underneath. Today's episode is a special one. It's titled Bad Vegan to Truth Teller. This is an interview with Sarma Melngailis. I was so honored to get the opportunity to talk with her. Sarma is best known for the Netflix docuseries Bad Vegan. But in her new memoir, The Girl with the Duck Tattoo, she reveals the deeper truth of her experience through a page-turning story of narcissistic abuse, manipulation, and ultimately resilience. In this first part of our conversation, we go beyond the headlines. You'll hear how covert patterns took root long before that public story, how repeated entanglements can happen even to strong, high-achieving people, and how self-awareness around empathy, sensitivity, neurodivergence can become a doorway to healing and guilt-free self-care. This is part one of a two-part series, and I just know that you're going to benefit so much from hearing Sarma's story. So let's dive in. So today, I welcome Sarma here on the show on the Covert Narcissism podcast. And Sarma, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we're going to just dive right in today and kind of get into this topic of covert narcissism and how it played out in your world. Okay. But before we do, I'd like to know, who is Sarma today? Let's, beyond the headlines, just kind of let us know who are you and what life looks like for you now.
Well, the headlines were pretty harsh for the most part. So I think that I am certainly a very different person than what the headlines portrayed, because my story, the one that's most well known, was the subject of Netflix docuseries, which told the story in a pretty misleading way. And so I was often characterized as just frankly as a villain in many ways. Not to everybody, but that's how it came across to a lot of people. So that's been that's made my own recovery from, as probably most of your listeners know, recovering from these types of situations is in itself a huge undertaking and really challenging. And so then on top of that, I've had to also try to correct a record and basically have to be in a position of having to explain myself to the public. And I was going to write a book no matter what, but that made writing my book really necessary. So I published a book called The Girl with the Duck Tattoo, which tells the story that was portrayed in this Netflix series that they called Bad Vegan, which the title itself was unfortunate for me. But what's also in my book that I think is really meaningful is a situation I was in before. And that I think is more relevant specifically to your podcast, the title of it being The Covert Narcissist, because in that relationship, which is a 4-year relationship, that guy would certainly fall into the category of more of a covert narcissist.
Okay.
Than the later story, which is much more explosive.
This is before the stories where the headlines start.
Yes, although there were tabloidy stories because this guy was a sort of a celebrity chef light. He wasn't this kind of celebrity chef that was on TV all the time, but he was very well known in New York and was kind of known as a celebrity chef when that term started to become a thing, and Food Network was really popular. And I was in a relationship with him for 4 years, and it drained me of all of my resources and then some, and left me confused. And, he had turned it around and tried to convince me I had borderline personality disorder. And, he comes across as very soft-spoken and humble and polite and gracious, and yet has done what he did with me to person after person after person. And now it's very well known. He's also been further exposed through a lot of articles and whatnot that have come out in the years since that. It was quite a long time ago that happened. But that relationship, now that I'm in that position where probably also many of your listeners find themselves, of doing an enormous amount of research and
Mhm.
understanding the different types of narcissists, and then narcissists versus sociopathy and what it all means. And um, one of the things that I've noticed as a pattern, which is really unfortunate, but I try to highlight it as much as I can because, if somebody had said this to me, I might have been more careful on the other side, is that in my case, I mean, this has happened to me. I have gotten myself entangled with whatever you want to call them, narcissists, sociopaths, the dark
The dark
triad
triad.
personality.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've gotten myself entangled with these people uh, with quite destructive effects more than three big times, and then I've also sort of tangled with them a bit here and there professionally, so in business situations, which is something that also happens with people, if you have a boss or a coworker or a business partner, or even an employee that might be a covert narcissist. So, and what I found initially shocking is that, having been through it already, I think that what happened is, after that experience with the guy who was sort of the celebrity chef, I think I came away, on the other side of it, this woman pointed out to me, "Well, he's a textbook sociopath." And I thought, "Huh?" And then I looked into it and I went, "Oh my God." And I understood, I felt like I understood that he was this disordered person. And, so that got me to the place of understanding that, um, who he is, and that it wasn't about me. That's just how he is. And this is how he behaves with everybody. But I think I must have come away from that a bit with that feeling like, if you get struck by lightning or bit by a shark, like, what are the odds it's going to happen again? Or as if it somehow had inoculated me, where in reality, I think it's the other way around, that whatever it is that makes me, and this is sometimes a delicate conversation because it's not victim blaming. It's just acknowledging that there are certain traits. And I always tell people they're good traits. There are certain traits, or, is it my energy? But there is something about me that it's like, you know, drawing these people to me because it's happened over and over and over again. And since the series came out on Netflix, I've heard from, I mean, thousands of people, because that came out in 2022, so it's been a few years, and I've heard from so many people, and I've also heard that it's extremely common for people to have had this happen over and over again.
Mhm.
And uh, and as you know, these people often present very differently, so they can be more overt and have kind of a very strong, grandiose personality, or they can seem very shy and humble and poor me, and they've had a rough life and they seem to be very sensitive, um and yet both situations can end up turning our world upside down and causing extreme amounts of destruction
Yeah,
and
that is
pain
absolutely true. Absolutely.
and confusion.
So, did you, in that path of self-reflection,
Mhm.
then were you able to pinpoint what are some of the things in you? I know the way I asked it to myself, because it's not victim blaming,
Yeah,
but what I asked in myself is, okay, what is it in me that caused me to not see these behaviors, to not see the abuse as abuse? Or to justify it, to explain it, to choose not to see it, because I know there were times that I turned the other turned away and looked away
right.
and made the excuses. So what is it in me that caused that? In that self-reflection, were you able to pinpoint some things?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And another interesting parallel that revealed itself rather quickly after this last one is that, especially because the major situation I got into that got the most attention was very much like being in a cult of one. Essentially, I was in a cult of one. So his behavior, his tactics, what he did, and what made me a good target for him, I realized was pretty much precisely the same as what makes people vulnerable to uh, cults and cult leaders. And so I've become very friendly and close with some of the people who are in the Nexium cult because our processes of understanding this very question is very similar. Um, but those are just traits that have made me, I guess, attractive prey to whatever type of narcissist. And for the most part, they're really good qualities. There's sort of an idealism. There's wanting to help. There's a always thinking the best in other people. Um, One of the most surprising things that happened also on the other side of this docuseries coming out, and I don't even like calling it a documentary because I think it should be called docutainment, or they didn't do it. They didn't. There was no journalistic integrity in that story. But once it came out, I noticed I was getting a ton of people in my DMs and messages asking me if I'd ever been diagnosed or evaluated as being on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum. And I thought, that's interesting. Why am I getting all these people asking me that question? And then, people were making videos, and there's like YouTube videos of people doing this psychological analysis of me and making the argument that I surely, would get a diagnosis of autism 1, which used to be called Asperger's. And I feel like it's made it a little more confusing calling it autism 1. And I thought that was so fascinating because I had studied it a bit on my own because I had had one, I'd been in a healthy relationship with a man who I think for sure would be on that would qualify as having Asperger's or autism 1, and was very familiar with those qualities, at least in men, and I think they exhibit themselves differently in men and women. Um, and I appreciate a lot of those qualities, and just thought that I was very compatible with him because I also have a tendency to need a lot of alone time and get overwhelmed by social situations. And but it had never occurred to me that I would get that diagnosis. So anyway, I ended up going through a very, one of those very formal evaluations with a specialist, and it's, they question your family, and there's a whole day long series of tests and a pretty thorough evaluation. And they did end up giving me that diagnosis. And then I started looking into it myself. And then it's not that it changed anything really. It just made a lot of things click into place. And it was another layer of understanding, and allowed me to have sort of a different layer of compassion for myself, I think, and for others, because now also more and more as I interact with other people who've been through this, I think it's extremely common that
Okay.
those of us who get targeted have a lot of those traits. And some of them are just, it's correlated with a tendency to need a lot of alone time and to not necessarily have a lot of close friendships. And so what does that do? That makes it easier for you to be somebody that's isolated. If you already have that tendency, it's easier to isolate you. Um, so it's anyway, that really helped me understand. And also just scoring extremely high on, if you take one of those quizzes, are you an empath? I'm like, yes, 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 all the way down. Uh,
Mhm.
Same with being a highly sensitive person. So, and I would argue that those are all qualities, for the most part, that I wouldn't wanna change. I mean, sometimes some of the things about being highly sensitive are a bit challenging, but I wouldn't wanna change those. It just, I think, requires learning about these types of personalities and learning what to look for, and, yeah, and kinda moving forward, like, eyes all the way wide open,
Yeah.
and learning to trust your gut and really pay attention to your intuition early on to be able to avoid these situations.
Yeah, for sure. I love that you're sharing this, and the aspect of the autism and the influence that that can have. I do strongly encourage the self reflection of, okay, what did I miss? What did why did I miss what I missed? And I usually find that many of the people who are victims of narcissistic behavior are overly self reflective. Okay, we're typically extremely self-reflective people, but
Yes.
we're self-reflective in regards to this other person in our life. Meaning, okay, I say the wrong thing? Did I do the wrong? Like, could I have said it better? And we replay 100 different ways to say something in order to say it. So that's that overly self-reflective. What I'm referring to is overly self-reflective. But I think what I'm hearing in you is, instead of being outwardly self-reflective of my interactions with other people, you took this and you did some internal self-reflection of, and you were open to it. You were open to, people are reaching out to you going, well, have you ever considered autism, or however it was worded to you? And to hear that you didn't approach that with, it didn't sound like, with self-judgment or self-blame or anything like that. Instead, you approached it with what I'm going to say is curiosity, and that
Yeah.
curiosity, I think, opens the door to us being able to reach that point of awareness, radical acceptance of what's going on without the self blame.
Yeah, and I think that there is something in that there's something about having that diagnosis, and there's something about having that diagnosis that indicates that there's something in my wiring, and I'm not, I'm not like a neuroscientist, I don't know how to, or psychologist, but there's something about having this diagnosis that makes it such that we just don't see the manipulation
Mhm.
as readily as others might. And, and whether we don't see it or we rationalize it away, or it's like a default setting where you just enter into and I know that I do this, and so I have to be hyper aware of it, but, you just sort of enter into every situation with this default assumption that everybody else is gonna treat you the way that you would treat them, and that is coming from a good faith place. And I think that, not everybody is like that. Maybe other people have a much healthier suspicion, or they have their guard up, or something. Um, but there is something about having that diagnosis that um, it makes it harder to see what others might see more quickly.
Okay. So, in getting that diagnosis, did that give you a little bit more, maybe freedom to be able to approach this without the judgment, like what I'm talking about? You're better able to see kind of your tendencies, your reactions, your way of interacting with other people, and maybe even opened up some more resources for you.
Yeah, well, it's helped me. I think most importantly, and it would be great to have learned this a lot earlier, and I think the reason why it's helpful to get this, to have a diagnosis or at least look into it, is that it's almost given me more permission to take care of myself in ways that other people don't see as being necessary. So, for example, and for whatever reason, I'm kind of going through a period right now where more than ever, I crave alone time. I need alone time. I get very overwhelmed by too much social activity, or people in my space. I live alone and I really need that. And so just having more grace for myself when, when I don't want to go spend Thanksgiving with my family. Like, sorry,
Mhm.
I just need to be by myself because I really need this downtime and this quiet time. And being in any sort of chaotic situation can be very overwhelming and destabilizing for me. Um,
Yeah.
so it's allowed me to take care of myself with less guilt and shame, because I think for years, I think for my entire life, a part of me always wondered what's wrong with me. Like, why am I so miserable in these situations where people seem like they're perfectly fine, and I'm, at this social event and just want to crawl out of my skin. And it's not a social anxiety, because it's not that I'm super nervous or uncomfortable in like a it's not social anxiety. It's just like I'm sitting there feeling like like my energy is being drained out of me, and it's just kind of generally overwhelming.
Mhm.
Um, so that's something that's really helped me a lot. And I think also in, in the context of relationships with people, I now know going forward too that, and I've closed myself off from any personal relationships or dating or anything like that for a while. I just feel like that's what I need to do for a while. But it would also allow me to be more able to express boundaries in a relationship as well.
Hmm. Yeah, it's I love how you turn this into self-care. Like, what a beautiful story that taking the manipulation you've experienced, the coercion, all the different ways you would say this, and what's come out of it is your ability to have self-care without self-judgment. When
Yeah.
you say giving myself permission to take care of myself in ways that other people don't see as necessary. Okay. And I get that. Other people might, well, what do you need that for? Why wouldn't you come to Thanksgiving? That those kind of situations. But you can stand in your truth or your needs, your own self-care needs. And just like you wouldn't need to give justification to brush your teeth every day, you don't
Yeah.
have to give justification for taking that alone time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, some of that might come naturally with age, just sort of it's often characteristic of women over 50 and post-menopause where you enter into that phase of life where you just are like, I don't care what people think. So
Mhm.
that's
That
come
adds
into
to it.
that's adds to it as well, where I've just
Yes.
learned to care less about other people's opinions and judgment.
Yeah,
But it's been an interesting, having to do so very publicly too, because it's not just not, I'm caring about the judgment of people around me or people that, I may not want to attend some party or event, but also kind of the judgment at large because, um, you know, it yeah, I've written a book and I'm on social media and my life has always been very public because I had a successful restaurant and a brand and I was growing this whole empire and I was the face of it. And even though that always made me sort of uncomfortable, I was aware that it was necessary. So nowadays it is very necessary for people to be out there on social media and putting yourself out there. And of course, more than ever, when you've just published a book, you need to be out there and talking about it and promoting it. But that also leaves you open to just all of the incoming judgment that comes.
absolutely.
I get loads of comments and incoming messages from mostly women, also men who've been manipulated or abused, and I get all of that incoming, which is really heartwarming. I mean, that's I get a lot of sympathy from people who understand it, and then I also am able to engage with other people and in a way that's helpful to them and to me. But but I'm also open to a lot of judgment and criticism, which comes in the form of some pretty harsh messages all the time, and I've had to learn to l as best as I can, let that roll off.
Yeah. I can relate to that, and I definitely understand that. And this is where I say, okay, other people's reactions to you, to me, to anyone listening, other people's reactions to you say far more about who they are than about who you are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I've certainly learned that as well, and I think that's also one of the major elements of healing from these types of situations is coming to that understanding that these varieties of abusers, because again, I've been through it multiple times, it's like getting bit by a snake, and it's not about it's it's on them, it's not about you. Obviously, I might think that I could have protected myself better, but, um
But a snake will still be a snake.
right, and they're gonna do it over and over again to everybody, and that's what's happened with the various characters, um, in my book. I mean, the man who was the main guy that was part of the story that was portrayed in the Netflix series and which is what my book mostly revolves around, um, you know, uh, astonishingly, people don't understand how he's not locked up in jail forever, but he was only in jail for a year. He got out and now he's doing the same thing to other people and somebody else, and there was another show on HBO that called Toxic that tracked him down, and, he's, of course, doing the same thing to somebody else, and, if those people on the other side of it probably reading my book would be too triggering for them, because one of the things I did is I included a ton of our actual conversations from G-chats. So the second half of the book is full of our actual dialogue where I was able to recover it. And so you can see in print, in his actual words, the ways in which he's manipulating me and the ways in which he's cutting me down and trying to hit various trigger points and all of the various tactics that people talk about. It's all there in print. Um, and and that's why I included so much of that in there. And then I also included a lot of my journal entries to sort of show what was going on in my mind or what was not going on in my mind. Because another thing that makes, I think, these situations really hard for people who've never been through it, I was going to say normal people, but people who've never been through it to understand, is that it's hard to understand concepts like dissociation and cognitive dissonance if you haven't been through something like that. So I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, most podcasts I do, people understand these types of situations. But early on, after Bad Vegan came out, I did a lot of mainstream podcasts and just constantly I was on defense, and it was painful. And I was getting the question a lot, what were you thinking? What were you thinking when he did this and you did that? But I don't understand, what were you feeling and why? And what people don't understand is that by that time, it's as if part of my brain was shut off and I was on autopilot, and that part of it, when you get into that state that is brought on by, cognitive dissonance and fear and confusion and
Fight or flight
exhaustion, and
response.
now you're frozen and numb and dissociated, then sort of by definition, you can't explain what were you thinking or feeling, because in a way you weren't thinking or feeling.
Right. Yeah, when you're in that survival mode, that survival and what you're describing, frozen in fear, fight or flight, you're in a reactive mode to all of this. There is literally a part of your brain that is not functional during that.
Yeah,
It's your logical center, it's the prefrontal cortex that controls, your higher thinking skills. The
yeah,
logical center, emotional regulator, just being able to, cause and effect, being able to think through a progression of things. You can't do it. Even short-term memory is heavily impacted because that
yep,
part of the brain is not functional.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and that's one of the things I find myself having to attempt to explain to a lot of people in these public settings.
Yeah. No, that's fair. At what point in all of this do you remember when you finally got your eyes opened to all of the manipulation and the coercion, and maybe what was it that caused those eyes to open up? We're going to pause right there and pick it up next week with part 2 of this mini series. If today's conversation resonated with you, the miscasting by the world, the over reflection that you carry, the permission to choose solitude without shame, I want you to know that you are not alone and you are not broken. In part 2, next week, titled Covert Narcissism Unmasked, Sarma shares the exact moment that her eyes opened, the Ice Queen gray rock tactics that she used to disengage, and the brain science behind why the fog lifts and why it returns sometimes. We'll also talk about the closure trap and how to shut the door for good. Your story matters, and you deserve to be heard without judgment. If you're ready to take the next step toward healing, check out my coaching services at covertnarcissism.com. I'm here, and I'm ready to help in any way that I can. I wish you so much peace on your journey of healing. You have been listening to the Covert Narcissism Podcast, where we break apart the insidious nature of these incredibly destructive and infinitely frustrating individuals. If you are caught up in this crazy-making relationship and drowning in self-doubt, guilt, or rumination, please reach out to me anytime. I offer individualized live coaching in both group and individual settings. We can find the right program for you. You do not need to go through this alone. You can find all of that information on my website at covertnarcissism.com. You can also reach out to me by email at Renee, Renee, at covertnarcissism.com. I do look forward to hearing from each and every one of you. Remember, I am not a therapist, and you are not a victim. I am a coach, and you are a survivor. The information provided by Renee Swanson, Covert Narcissism Podcast, and CNG Life Coaching is for educational purposes only and is not to be used for diagnosis purposes. It is not intended to be a substitute for clinical care. Please consult a healthcare provider for guidance specific to your case. This material discusses narcissism in general. Renee shares stories from her personal experience as well as from those that she has worked with for several years. Her material does not claim that any specific person has narcissism and should not be used to refer to any specific person as having narcissism. Permission is not granted to link to or repost this material to support an allegation or support a claim that any specific person is a narcissist. That would be an unauthorized misuse of the material and the information provided. Thank you.